In recent years, news regarding the removal of Confederate statues throughout the country came into focus. These statues were mostly constructed as racism became more severe in the early 1900s throughout the South. And as we're still coping with the issues of police brutality and racial inequality, understanding what the Civil War was and its legacy is essential to understanding the country today. The war that made Lincoln one of the greatest presidents of the nation, and the most brutal one that America ever fought in. Let's look closely at the Civil War. The year is 1860. As Lincoln, a dark horse candidate, got elected to the presidency, the political world and the entire country was shaken by the news. The fragile relationship between the South and the North was at its breaking point, and war seemed inevitable even after the compromises. So why did war finally occur in 1861, right after Lincoln was elected? There are four main reasons for this. First is sectionalism. Large plantations were supported by a large number of slaves, and poor whites with small farms were also abundant in the South. On the other hand, industrialization was underway in the North, and factories and manufacturing in large cities such as New York and Philadelphia leading the way. These different ways of life and environments have solidified since the very creation of the nation 80 years ago. Second, it was the question of state versus federal government. The southern states were especially vocal about their rights being violated by the federal government, and believed in their rights to nullify federal laws and eventually secede from the Union. Third is slavery, a thorny issue that determined how the nation should expand. As new territories were converted to individual states, conflict arose on whether these new states would be slave or free states. And as the northern opinion steered towards anti-slavery, and as fervent abolitionists such as John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry in October 1859, Southerners felt compelled to defend their peculiar institution, slavery. Lastly, the most direct reason was the election of Lincoln in 1860. The newly created Republican Party opposed slavery expanding into the new states, and Lincoln, the Republican candidate, wins the election comfortably due to Democrats being divided into the North and the South. And as Lincoln's election was confirmed, the southern states felt their system of slavery and states' rights were threatened. So starting with South Carolina, southern states start to secede from the Union one by one. So a month after the election on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. And Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas followed for a total of 7 seceded states. And in February 1861, these 7 states come together and form the Confederate States of America under President Jefferson Davis. And this all happened before Lincoln even started his presidential term. In March, in his first inaugural address, Lincoln makes it clear that he intends to preserve the Union at all costs. Next month, in a Union garrison within Confederate territory called Fort Sumter, supplies were running out for the station soldiers. So they called for help, and Lincoln sent a relief expedition, to which the South responded by bombarding the fort on April 12, 1961. This first battle started only 6 weeks into Lincoln's presidency. There were no direct casualties as a result of this engagement, but Lincoln couldn't withstand a Confederate attack on a federal fort. Lincoln immediately calls for volunteers to quell the rebellion, and the South responds in kind. And 4 states, including Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, eventually joined the Confederacy to make a total of 11 states under rebellion. Now the border states came into question. Slavery was legal in these middle states, but they haven't yet seceded from the Union. So Lincoln took decisive action. He moved the army into Maryland and Washington, D.C. to seize control and suspended the writ of habeas corpus to arrest dissenters without trial. Missouri was a particular case where Missourians joined both the Union and the Confederate side, and there was constant guerrilla warfare between two troops. Kentucky largely came into control of the Union after its legislature petitioned the Union Army to help defend against the Confederate general. So preventing these states from joining the Confederacy was a major blow to manufacturing in the South. Later, Lincoln, who was born in Kentucky, is reputed to have said, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." This shows how important taking control of these border states were. Before we get into the war, we need to compare the strengths of each side. First, the population of the North was 22 million, while the South's was 9 million, with 3.5 million of them being slaves. And as immigrants and runaway slaves joined the Union side, the disparity of population became more severe. Economic differences were even more acute. The North had 8 times more manufacturing capacity, including railroads, uniforms, weapons, and food. The South focused on cotton production, and with the North's naval blockade and scorched earth policy at the end, the South suffered from lack of provisions towards the end. The South has some important advantages, however, because they were fighting a defensive war. The South had to defend just well enough to sign a treaty and gain independence. And because most of the fighting was done in their soil, they were more familiar with the landscape, and the soldiers were more motivated to fight initially because they fought to defend their ways of life. Lastly, a competent general named Robert E. Lee rejected command of the Union Army and followed his home state of Virginia to join the Confederacy. He showed brilliant leadership until the end, but no one knew how long this war would drag out. Looking at the initial strategies of the North, the first was the Anaconda Plan, which was to implement a naval blockade and take control of the Mississippi River and squeeze the South economically. Second was to advance through the middle states to take key cities in the west, and the last was to advance onto Richmond in the east. The distance between Richmond and Washington, D.C. was uncomfortably close at 95 miles, and many bloody battles occurred in this eastern theater. So executing these strategies successfully was key to Union victory. Lincoln wanted to promptly end the war, but the regular army was a meager 16,000 men strong, so he called for 75,000 volunteers to finish the war in 90 days. And as the pressure mounted from the public and the press to attack, 35,000 poorly trained Northerners nevertheless confidently invaded Virginia. And they met Confederate troops only 30 miles away from D.C. Being complacent, many Northerners set up picnics near the battlefield to watch the battle, and the Civil War got underway with the first battle of the Bull Run. July 21st, 1861, it was a hot summer day. "35,000 Northern troops under General McDowell met a similar-sized Southern army under General Beauregard. The Southern Army initially retreated under Northern attack, but they managed to form a firm defensive line under General Thomas Jackson. He gained the nickname Stonewall for his defensive prowess in this battle, and the South went on a ferocious counterattack and drove the Northern Army past the Potomac River. The surprised picnickers escaped together with the troops, and the North had 3,000 casualties while the South had 2,000, and the South just won its first major victory in the war. This defeat came at a huge shock to the federal government, and their hopes of a quick and easy victory disappeared. Meanwhile, the South likewise suffered a lot of casualties, but confidence grew in their military capabilities. Initially rejecting the volunteers, the North as well as the South implemented conscription to prepare for a long and bloody war. The Civil War had the most American casualties out of all wars America participated in, and out of the 620,000 casualties, 2/3 of them died of diseases. But it's important to note the destructive effects of more advanced weapons of the time. Mini balls were for the first time distributed to American soldiers on a large scale. Invented by the French inventor Claude-Étienne Minier, this ammunition was cone cylindrical shaped rather than the traditional spherical musket balls. So when it fired, it spun around its axis. So its range and reload time was significantly improved, and its damage to the body and bones was much more destructive. The cannons were also rifled and improved. And because the soldiers were stuck with the 19th century Napoleonic line tactics, infantrymen were bound to take immense casualties during this war. After the North's first defeat, George McClellan became General-in-Chief of all Union armies. He was a brilliant organizer and turned the Potomac Army into a formidable force. However, because he was a very tentative man, he often grossly overestimated the Southern Army's strength. So he gained the nickname Tardy George for being overcautious, and after Lincoln finally issued firm orders to advance, in March 1862, the Potomac Army advanced towards Richmond. But being overcautious again, the Potomac Army decides to go through the river, around, and through the peninsula, thus called the Peninsula Campaign. The Union Army landed at Fort Monroe and succeeded in pushing through Yorktown and Williamsburg. It took 2 months just to advance near Richmond, and the Confederates, while retreating, strengthened their defenses around Richmond in the meantime. The Union Navy attempted to pass through the river but were stopped at Drury's Bluff on May 15th. And by then, the Union Army was on the doorsteps of Richmond, so Confederate General Joseph Johnston attempted to break through the Northern line in the Battle of Seven Pines, but failed. To add to the loss, Johnston got injured in the battle, and Lee then commanded the famous Army of Northern Virginia. Lee then turned the tides with his brilliant leadership. On June 26, Lee engaged the Union Army in a daring counterattack to threaten the North's supply line along the York Railroad. Responding to the Confederate attack from the north and its defensive line broken, the Union Army had to retreat towards the south towards the James River. After a brutal 7-day battle, the North held at Malvern Hill and were then issued to retreat by water. With the last battle of the Peninsula Campaign, the 7-day battle, the campaign ended and the North lost initiative. Out of the 200,000 soldiers who fought in this campaign, the North suffered 23,000 casualties while the South suffered 29,000 casualties. However, after the tactical victory, the Confederates' confidence skyrocketed, and General Lee now could take the initiative. But you can see that in the Civil War, the number of casualties often did not correlate with tactical victory. The Western Theater followed a completely different story. Ulysses Grant's Army of the Tennessee took Fort Henry and Donelson in February 1862 and also succeeded in taking Nashville. Then in April, the Union Army held off a massive attack at Shiloh from the South's Army of the Mississippi. The Union Navy under Admiral Farragut took New Orleans in April and Memphis in June. Only the city of Vicksburg stood in the way of northern control of the Mississippi River. Vicksburg would hold off for another year, but we see that the Union Army fared much better in the Western Theater. Grant's successes in the West catches the eyes of Lincoln, and later they form a close relationship, and Grant would become the foremost Union general. Going back to the Eastern Theater. After McClellan's retreat, Lee marches towards the north. The Confederate Army ran into the Union Army of Virginia under Major General John Pope and won handily in the Second Battle of Bull Run, suffering only half of Union casualties. So Lee confidently pushed into the state of Maryland, also hoping to draw some Marylanders into their army. But Marylanders were only shocked by the Confederates' exhausted, impoverished situation. Droves of soldiers also started deserting their positions. So amid this desperate situation, they also had to face the trailing Union Army. After General Pope's big defeat, Lincoln didn't have many options but to reinstate tardy George McClellan to the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And in a huge stroke of luck, a Union soldier found the Confederate tactical plan rolled around a cigar, and so with his knowledge, the Union Army rushed to meet the Confederate Army. Finally, on September 17th, McClellan's army met Lee's army in the Battle of Antietam. A brutal battle ensued, and no decisive victory was in sight, but the North did succeed in holding off the South's advance. And because of immense casualties, Lee's army had to retreat back to the south, and McClellan again showed his overcautiousness by not pursuing the Confederate army into the south. Because of this, Lincoln developed a mistrust of McClellan and fired him again, and McClellan would bide his time for revenge. The Battle of Antietam resulted in the most American casualties in a single day of the Civil War of about 22,000. But this tactical victory of the North had a bigger meaning. That is, Lincoln thought it was the right time to declare the Emancipation Proclamation 5 days after the battle. Declared on September 23, 1862 and coming into effect January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Declaration did not immediately free all slaves, but it nevertheless brought important advantages to the North. What effects did the Emancipation Proclamation have? First, it changed the aim of the war for the North. Before, Lincoln's primary aim was to preserve the Union, and if the South had surrendered early, slavery could have been preserved in the South. But after 2 years of brutal war and suffering thousands of casualties, Lincoln couldn't let the South continue their way of life, particularly slavery. Abolishing slavery became a definite goal of the North. Second, Britain and France couldn't intervene in the war. To check America's influence, Britain and France were eyeing intervention. But having already abolished slavery in their empires, both the British and the French could not dare to side with the South, who supported an institution already largely unaccepted around the world. But the winter of 1862 was hard for the North. The proclamation was fervently opposed not only in the South but parts of the North, and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was largely intact. Piling casualties largely demoralized the troops. Victory seemed nowhere near. How could Lincoln turn the tides? We'll continue on with part 2.